Linda once thought she would never have the chance to rebuild her life. At 34, after years of struggling with addiction and rehabilitation, she finally found a place to start anew. The social housing in Ohio wasn't ideal, but for Linda, it was everything she needed. A small, simple apartment on the edge of town, far from the dark memories of her past. She told herself this was the only place where someone like her could hope to rebuild her life. Linda's apartment was on the second floor of the building, where only 2 other apartments were occupied. One belonged to a quiet, friendly elderly couple, and the other housed a group of young people, seemingly students or unemployed individuals. Linda didn't care much about them, as long as no one caused trouble for her. This new life, though solitary, was peaceful, which was exactly what Linda needed to find herself again. However, the peace didn't last long. From the first days of moving in, Linda was drawn to the old mansion next to the building. It was a massive structure, with high walls and adjoining wings, creating a gloomy and mysterious image. The mansion seemed to stand silently, abandoned for decades, with peeling plaster and dirty windows covered by thick, moldy curtains. Every time she looked at the mansion, Linda couldn't help but feel a strange coldness, as if the place held a dark secret. Initially, Linda tried to dismiss the feeling of unease. She told herself it was just her imagination, that the mansion could do nothing but stand there, silent and decaying over time. But then, strange things began to happen. One morning while making coffee, Linda noticed the mansion's wall seemed closer. The details on the curtains and windows became unusually clear, as if the mansion was moving toward her. The narrow alley between the building and the mansion also seemed to shrink, making Linda feel suffocated. She tried to rationalize it by telling herself she was just tired or sleep-deprived. However, the sense of unease didn't disappear. Every morning, as Linda sat writing in her journal, a habit she learned during rehabilitation, she noticed the sunlight no longer entered her apartment as before. It wasn't cloudy days, as the sun was still visible in the sky, but the light seemed to be blocked. Unable to penetrate the narrow alley, Linda began to feel something was very wrong, but she didn't know what to do to confront it. Gradually, the mansion's strangeness became more apparent. Linda felt as if the place wasn't just an abandoned building, but a living entity, something watching her, waiting for her. And as she started to realize she couldn't escape the mansion's presence, fear began to creep into her mind like a shadow that couldn't be dispelled. Linda began to notice unusual things just a few days after moving in. The old mansion next door, which had stood silently like a ghost, now seemed to be changing. At first, she wasn't sure what she was seeing. The mansion's wall, once distant, now seemed closer. Small details she hadn't noticed before: the dirt on the windows, the moldy patterns on the curtain snow appeared strangely clear. Linda tried to rationalize it as just the sunlight or a change in perspective, but the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't just the wall. The alley between the building and the mansion also showed signs of narrowing. Linda first noticed this when she stood by her living room window, looking down at the alley. It seemed smaller than before, as if the walls were gradually closing in. She tried to dismiss the feeling, telling herself she was just imagining it. But each passing day, the alley seemed more cramped, to the point where she couldn't ignore the oddity. Linda decided to investigate further. She started asking her neighbors, hoping they had noticed the strange changes too. She knocked on the apartment of the elderly couple living downstairs. The woman opened the door, her face kind, but slightly puzzled to see Linda so early in the morning. Linda tried to express her question as clearly as possible, but when she mentioned the alley and the mansion, the old woman just shook her head. "We don't pay attention to it," she said. "My husband even placed a wardrobe against the window to avoid looking at that building." Linda felt disappointed. She apologized for bothering them and returned to her apartment. Not giving up, Linda decided to ask the group of young people living downstairs. When she knocked, a red-haired girl with a tired expression opened the door. Linda brought up the mansion, but Her question only seemed to annoy the girl. "Why not ask the people who live there?" the girl replied coldly. Before Linda could say anything more, the door was slammed shut in her face. The indifference of her neighbors made Linda feel more isolated than ever. The mansion's unusual signs continued to appear, but no one else seemed to care. The strangeness grew more evident, like a silent shadow spreading. Linda began to feel as if she was being watched, as if the mansion was not just a building, but a living entity. An entity full of mystery, danger, and slowly closing in on her. Linda began to clearly sense the abnormality when the sunlight, which used to flood through her window every morning, suddenly disappeared. At first, she thought it was just a cloudy day, but when she looked outside, the sky was still blue, without a single cloud. The light still shone on other parts of the building, but her apartment was covered by a strange shadow, as if something invisible was blocking it. A cold feeling crept through the space, making her shiver. Linda tried to explain this phenomenon, but every theory led to a dead end. She stood by the window, looking at the alley between the building and the mansion. It looked smaller than before, almost not wide enough for a person to pass through. The mansion's walls seemed alive, gradually pressing closer to the building, making Linda feel suffocated. She wondered if she was losing her mind, but the feeling of unease grew, impossible to ignore. Determined to find evidence, Linda took out her phone and started taking pictures. She photographed every corner of the apartment, every detail of the alley, and the mansion next door. When she looked at the screen, everything appeared normal. The alley was still as wide as before, and sunlight still naturally shone in. But when Linda looked up from the screen and observed with her eyes, everything was completely different. The alley looked cramped, and darkness still covered her apartment. The photos didn't reflect anything she was experiencing, as if a mysterious veil was hiding the truth. Linda continued taking photos for days, trying to capture the change she felt. But the results remained the same. The photos didn't show any signs of abnormality. She tried sending them to a close friend for review, but her friend just replied that everything looked completely normal. This made Linda even more confused. She knew what she saw wasn't an illusion. Something was happening, something beyond her ability to explain. Each day, the alley continued to narrow. Linda felt like she was trapped in an invisible box, with the walls closing in. The presence of the mansion became heavier, as if it was trying to invade her life. Linda's dreams also began to change. She often dreamed of standing in front of the mansion, the large door opening, revealing a deep darkness inside, inviting her to step in. Upon waking, Linda always felt exhausted, as if the dream had drained her energy. She knew she needed to do something, but didn't know where to start. The strange phenomena became increasingly clear, but no one else noticed them. Linda felt isolated, trapped in a story she didn't understand, with a supernatural entity gradually approaching, dangerous and powerful. Linda decided that she couldn't continue enduring this abnormality alone. She needed to find someone to share with, to confirm that what she was experiencing wasn't an illusion. After much hesitation, she decided to meet the group of young people living in the apartment below Jen, Phil, Will, Steve, and Jay. They were the only ones in the building Linda felt might be more open, even though she had never really talked to them before. That evening, Linda knocked on the group's apartment door. Jen, the red-haired girl Linda had met before, opened the door. Seeing Linda's worried expression, Jen didn't ask anything further, but invited her in. Inside, the group was sitting around a small table, the light from an old chandelier casting a soft yellow glow, making the space both warm and strange. Linda felt somewhat relieved to see they weren't distant like before. Linda began to recount the strange phenomena she had experienced: the disappearing sunlight, the narrowing alley, and the suffocating feeling from the mansion. She spoke sincerely, not hiding her confusion and fear. When she finished, the room became eerily silent. No one laughed or mocked her. Instead, they looked at each other, as if trying to find an explanation. Phil, a guy with messy hair, spoke first. "We've noticed strange things too," he said, his voice low and serious. "That mansion, It's not normal. We all feel it's changing, but no one knows why." Jen nodded, adding, "Sometimes I feel like someone is standing behind the mansion's window, looking out. But when I try to look closer, there's nothing there." Linda shivered. Their words mirrored exactly what she'd experienced. But what chilled her the most was when Will, who seemed the quietest in the group, began to tell his story. "I've seen a shadow," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "One night, when I was smoking on the balcony, I saw a dark figure standing behind the mansion's curtain. It didn't move, just stood there, as if watching me. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I knew it was there." The room became quieter than ever. Linda looked at Will, sensing the fear in his eyes. His account reminded her of the strange dream she had of the mansion's large door, the deep darkness inside, and the feeling of being invited in. Steve, who seemed the most practical in the group, tried to break the silence. "We need to find out more. If all of us are feeling this, then something is definitely happening." Jay, the youngest, just sat silently, his eyes full of worry. Linda knew she had found people who shared her fear, but that didn't make her feel safer. On the contrary, it confirmed that the mansion wasn't just an old building. It was a living entity, dangerous and powerful, gradually invading their lives, and Linda knew this was only the beginning. That night, Linda fell asleep in a state of unease. Her mind was still haunted by Will's story and the strange phenomena she and the young group had shared. But even in her dreams, she couldn't find peace. Vague images of the mansion, deep darkness, and a mysterious call kept appearing, pulling her into a whirlpool of fear. Around midnight, Linda startled awake. The room was dark, with only a faint light from the street lamp outside filtering through the curtain. But it wasn't the light that woke her. It was the sound. A horrifying grinding noise echoed from outside the window, prolonged and steady, as if someone was trying to crush something with their teeth. Mixed with it was a heavy, loud breathing, like a giant creature standing right outside, just a few steps away. Linda held her breath, trying to listen. Her heart pounded so hard she feared it would reveal her presence. She didn't want to move, didn't want to make any noise, but curiosity and fear won out. Linda slowly stepped down from the bed, inching towards the window. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to look outside without drawing attention. The scene before her froze her in place. The mansion's wall, once a static old stone, was now moving. It pulsed like a living creature, each beat resembling a breath. Strange swellings began to appear on the wall's surface, growing larger by the second. They looked like fleshy sacs, swollen and quivering in the dim light. Linda felt a chill run down her spine, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the horrifying sight. Suddenly, one of the largest swellings burst open. The sound of ripping echoed sharply, like flesh being torn apart. From inside, a mass of red flesh emerged, slick and full of veins. A thick yellow liquid oozed from the crack, dripping onto the ground below, forming sticky puddles. A terrible stench immediately spread, assaulting Linda's nose. She had to cover her mouth to keep from vomiting, but tears streamed down her face from the overwhelming smell. Linda backed away, her hands trembling as she pulled the curtain closed. But just as she was about to turn away, another movement caught her eye. From within the exposed flesh, something began to stir. It was indistinct, just a vague shadow, but Linda could feel its gazia, powerful, haunting presence. It didn't need to look at her directly, but Linda knew it had sensed her. It knew she was there. Linda rushed to her bed, pulling the blanket over her head, trying to stifle her sobs. The grinding and breathing noises continued outside, like a relentless horror soundtrack. She couldn't sleep anymore, just lay there, trembling, waiting for dawn, while the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She knew that tonight was only the beginning, and what awaited her ahead was far more terrifying. The news of Will's disappearance reached Linda on a cold and gloomy morning. Jen, with red eyes and a panicked expression, knocked on Linda's door, her voice trembling. Will has disappeared," she said, the words choking in her throat. Linda stood motionless, feeling as if the blood in her veins had stopped flowing. She couldn't believe her ears just yesterday. Will was sitting with them, talking about the vague figure behind the mansion's curtain. The young group gathered in Jen's apartment, each carrying fear and confusion. Phil, who usually maintained calm, couldn't hide his worry now. He recounted that Will had left the apartment the previous evening saying he wanted to take a walk to clear things up. But by morning, no one had seen him return. Will's phone was unreachable, and all his belongings were still in his room as if he had vanished into thin air without a trace. Steve, who always tried to find a reasonable explanation for everything, couldn't conceal his unease. Maybe he just went somewhere, got lost, or encountered something unexpected, he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Jay, the youngest in the group, sat silently, eyes fixed on the floor, full of worry. Linda said nothing, but she knew in her heart that Will's disappearance was no coincidence. The mansion, that mysterious and dangerous entity, was certainly involved. She recalled Will's stories about the figure behind the curtain and the strange phenomena they all had experienced. Now, the mansion was not just a vague threat. It had become a living entity capable of swallowing people, making them part of it. Jen, with tear-filled eyes, looked at Linda. "Do you think the mansion did something to Will?" Linda didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to admit what they were all thinking, but her silence spoke volumes. Panic began to spread among the group. Phil and Steve argued about whether they should report to the police, but both knew that no one would believe their story. Jay suggested leaving the apartment complex immediately, but Jen opposed. "If we leave, will it be safer, or will we only make it angrier?" Her question made the atmosphere in the room even more tense. Feeling the danger approaching, Linda decided to act. "I'll move into Jen's apartment," she said, her voice full of determination. "We need to stay together. If we separate, it will easily take us down one by one." Jen nodded in agreement, but her eyes were still filled with fear. That evening, Linda moved her belongings to Jen's apartment. The group tried to reassure each other, but no one truly felt safe. Outside, the mansion stood there, motionless and ominous, like a predator waiting for its chance. Linda felt as if it was watching them, every step, every breath. And in the darkness, she couldn't stop thinking about Will, whether he was still alive or had become part of something beyond their understanding. That night, Linda lay on the sofa in Jen's apartment, eyes wide open, unable to sleep. She heard the wind whistling through the window cracks, and within it, there seemed to be whispers. A chilling sensation enveloped her, as if the mansion was inching closer bit by bit. Linda knew this was only the beginning, and Will's disappearance was just the first sign of more terrifying things awaiting them. Linda returned to her apartment in the evening, after spending the entire day at Jen's apartment discussing Will's disappearance. The atmosphere in the apartment complex was heavier than ever. Each of her footsteps in the hallway echoed strangely, as if someone was watching from the shadows. She sensed an invisible, cold, and threatening presence, but couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. When Linda opened her apartment door, a cold wind blew in from the window, carrying the familiar foul smell, the same odor she had smelled on the horrifying night before. She shivered but tried to calm herself. "It's just imagination," she told herself, but deep down, she knew it wasn't true. As she stepped into the living room, a loud noise suddenly erupted from behind. The window burst open, and a grotesque creature lunged in, causing Linda to tumble to the floor. The creature was tall, with a body swollen with bright red welts, like lumps of flesh waiting to explode. Its skin was slick and shiny, and every movement it made emitted a screech like metal being dragged across the ground. Its eyes, if they could be called ice, were two deep black pits that didn't reflect light but radiated an indescribable malice. Linda screamed, trying to back away, but the creature quickly advanced. It extended long arms, covered in pus and slimy liquid, attempting to grab her. A horrifying screech sounded from its mouth, at least from where she thought its mouth was like a warning or a malicious invitation. Linda felt herself being pulled toward the window, where the mansion lay in darkness, like a giant mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She struggled, trying to escape the creature's grip, but its strength was overwhelming. Sharp claws dug into her arms, causing excruciating pain. Linda was nearly in despair when suddenly the apartment door burst open and the young group rushed in. Jen, Phil, Steve, and Jay carried whatever they could: fine sticks, kitchen knives, and even large flashlights. "Let her go!" Phil shouted, charging and striking the creature's swollen body with a stick. A piercing screech rang out as the creature retreated, but it didn't give up easily. It turned to attack Phil, but Jen and Steve quickly supported him, hitting the welts on its body. The welts burst open, spewing thick yellow liquid and spreading a foul stench throughout the room. Jay, with a kitchen knife in hand, aimed at the creature's head and stabbed forcefully. The creature screeched one last time, then retreated, its body writhing in pain. Finally, it lunged through the window, disappearing into the darkness, leaving a trail of slimy liquid on the floor. Breathing heavily and trembling, Linda was helped up by Jen and Phil. She looked around the room, now filled with stench and traces of the battle. It wanted to pull me into the mansion," she said, her voice choked. "I saw it. That darkness. It's waiting." The group fell silent, no one saying anything more. They knew this creature wasn't the only thing the mansion would send. And the most terrifying truth was, the mansion wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, and it wouldn't stop until it consumed them all. Linda woke up in Jen's apartment after a haunting night. The encounter with the grotesque creature from the mansion still lingered in her mind, but what was more frightening was the persistent sense of unease. It had only grown heavier. The air in the apartment was now chillingly suffocating, as if every breath was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The light from the window had become dim, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to be moving, even though no one was there. Jen emerged from the bedroom, her face pale. "Did you hear the noises?" she asked, her voice trembling. Linda nodded but said nothing. The noises, the faint screeches, the soft knocks had been present throughout the night, preventing them from sleeping peacefully, but now they were no longer isolated sounds. They felt like a warning, a sign that something terrible was about to happen. When the group gathered in the living room, Phil pointed out something strange. "The hallway outside? It doesn't look the same anymore." Everyone looked at each other, then stepped outside to check, and as Phil had said, the hallway had changed. The previously flat walls were now distorted, with bulging veins like pulsating blood vessels. The light from the hallway bulbs had become weak, flickering continuously, casting bizarre shadows on the walls. Steve tried opening the apartment door opposite, but it wouldn't budge, as if it was tightly locked from the inside. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice tense. But when the group headed towards the stairs, they found it had disappeared. Instead, a large wall blocked the way, smooth and cold. "No way," Jen whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Linda ran to the elevator, but when the doors opened, inside was not the familiar elevator cabin. Instead, a deep, dark void appeared, like a giant mouth waiting to swallow anyone who stepped in. She backed away, heart pounding. "It's changing everything," she said, her voice filled with despair. "The mansion, it doesn't just want us, it wants the entire building." The young group tried to find another escape route, but every door, every hallway led to inexplicable places. Some doors opened to distorted rooms, with walls that seemed to breathe. Others led to endless corridors with no end. A faint screech echoed from somewhere, growing closer, as if something was moving in the darkness watching them. Jay, the youngest in the group, began to panic. "We'll never escape. It will swallow us just like Will." Linda held Jay's shoulders, trying to reassure him, but she knew he was right. The mansion or whatever was controlling the building wouldn't let them leave easily. It wanted them to stay. wanted them to become part of it. When the group returned to Jen's apartment, they realized that even this place was no longer safe. The walls began to deform, as if being stretched by an invisible force. The screeching became clearer, and from a dark corner in the living room, a shadow began to emerge, vague and threatening. Linda looked around, trying to find a solution. We can't let it control our minds. If we panic, it will get stronger. But even she wasn't sure how long she could remain calm. This supernatural entity, the one controlling the mansion and the building, was not just dangerous. It was powerful, like a supreme deity, capable of altering reality at will. In the cold and eerie darkness, Linda and her friend stood silently, surrounded by isolation and despair. They knew time was running out, and if they couldn't find a way to escape, they would be forever consumed by this monstrous entity becoming part of it, just like Will. Jen's apartment was engulfed in heavy silence, with only the rapid breathing of the group audible. The cold air enveloped them, as if all the warmth had been sucked away by some invisible entity. Linda sat on a chair, her hands trembling as she held her head, trying to find a solution. But every thought was blocked by the fear gnawing at her mind. Phil, who always maintained a calm demeanor, stood up and walked towards the kitchen. "I need water," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't drink the water here," Jen warned, her eyes filled with concern. "We don't know if it's safe." But Phil ignored the advice. He turned on the tap, letting the cold water flow. The dim light from the kitchen bulb made the water appear normal, but Linda sensed something was off. The water seemed too clear, as if it didn't belong to this place. Phil bent down, took a large gulp, and immediately everything changed. He stood motionless, eyes wide open, hands gripping the sink as if his body had just frozen. "Phil?" Linda called, her voice full of worry, but he didn't respond. A faint screech sounded from somewhere, and everyone felt the presence of something they couldn't see but was extremely dangerous. Phil began to tremble, his body convulsing violently. "What's happening to him?" Steve shouted, but no one had an answer. Phil's skin started to change, becoming wrinkled and turning a dull gray. Small cracks appeared on his face, then spread across his body. From those cracks, a thick, black, slimy liquid began to ooze out, as if his body was melting from the inside. Phil screamed, a cry of pain and despair, but it was quickly stifled by the horrific transformation. His body collapsed, each part of flesh and bone dissolving into a mass of black liquid spreading across the floor. The stench rose, forcing everyone to back away, covering their noses to avoid vomiting. Linda stood frozen, eyes wide open, unable to believe what had just happened before her eyes. "Phil," Jen whispered, tears streaming down, but their friend was no more. What remained was a grotesque pool of black liquid, still smoking and emitting faint, screeching sounds, as if it were alive. No one dared to approach. The group just stood there, surrounded by horror and despair. "We can't stay here," Steve said, his voice trembling. "It doesn't just want to kill us. It wants to make us a part of it." Linda looked around, trying to calm herself, but she knew that everything was spiraling out of control. This supernatural entity, the one controlling the building, was not just dangerous, it was powerful, and it was toying with them, bit by bit. Jay, the youngest in the group, started to cry. "We're gonna die here. It's going to kill us all, just like Phil." Linda stepped forward, trying to stay calm. "We have to find a way out. No matter what happens, we can't let it win." But deep down, she knew their time was running out. And with Phil's horrifying death, the group realized they had few options left. This entity didn't just want to consume the building, it wanted to consume their very souls. The air in the building became more suffocating than ever, as if every breath was being choked by an invisible force. After Phil's horrifying death, the group was surrounded by fear and despair. Linda tried to stay calm, but couldn't stop the chill creeping into her mind. The faint screeches still echoed from somewhere, getting closer each moment, as if the supernatural entity was approaching, waiting to devour them. As everyone was trying to find a way out, something strange happened. At the end of the hallway, where there had previously been just a blank wall, an old wooden door appeared. It looked abandoned for a long time, with cracks and peeling paint, yet it exuded a strange mystery. The dim light from the hallway bulb cast gloomy shadows around the door, as if it didn't belong to this place. Jay, the youngest in the group, stepped closer to the door. "Maybe this is the way out," he said, his voice full of hope but tinged with fear. Linda sensed something was wrong. This door was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't just an object, it felt like a living entity, inviting them to step inside. But at the same time, she sensed a lurking danger, as if the door was a trap set to lure the desperate. "Don't open it, Jay," Linda said, her voice trembling. "We don't know what's behind it." But Jay didn't listen. He approached, his hand trembling as he touched the doorknob. "We can't stay here forever. I have to try. If this is the only way out, I'll do it." He turned to look at everyone, eyes full of determination, then slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open with a chilling sound, revealing a deep, dark void inside. There was no light, nothing but absolute darkness. Jay stood for a moment, as if mesmerized by something in the darkness, then stepped in. "Jay, don't!" Jen shouted, but he didn't turn back. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a deadly silence. Linda rushed over, trying to open the door, but the knob wouldn't budge. She pounded on the door, calling Jay's name, but there was no response. The door was now just an inanimate object, showing no signs of life. "He's gone," Steve said, his voice filled with despair. It took him. Linda stepped back, her eyes still fixed on the door. She felt a cold draft coming from it, as if something was breathing on the other side. The door wasn't just a trap, it was part of the supernatural entity, a tool to consume desperate souls. But at the same time, Linda felt it might be their last hope. If Jay had found a way out, perhaps they could too. "We have to do something," Linda said, her voice full of determination. "This door is dangerous, but it might also be the way out. If we don't try, we'll die here." Everyone looked at her, eyes filled with worry and fear. No one wanted to step into the darkness, but they knew time was running out, and the supernatural entity wouldn't let them survive much longer. Linda stood before the door, her hand trembling as she touched the knob. She knew that once she stepped in, she might never come back. But she also knew this was the only chance to escape the isolation and horror of the building. In the cold, powerful darkness, Linda took a deep breath, preparing for the final confrontation with the supernatural entity. The air in the building became unbearably suffocating. Everything around Linda was now just cold, isolating darkness full of horror. The faint screeches, sounds like the breathing of a giant entity, echoed in the space, making her feel as if she was being watched by something invisible but extremely dangerous. Her friends had all disappeared. Phil melted into a horrifying mass. Jay stepped into the mysterious wooden door and never returned, and the others were consumed by madness or by the building itself. Linda stood in the hallway, the weak light from the single bulb in the building flickering, as if it too was afraid. Around her were cracked walls, dried bloodstains, and signs of death. She knew she couldn't escape. This building wasn't a normal place, but a living entity, a trap created to consume anyone who entered. It didn't just want their bodies, it wanted their souls, their despair, and their last hopes. The wooden door still stood there at the end of the hallway, like an eerie invitation. Linda felt its presence now as an inanimate object, but as a living entity breathing, waiting. She knew behind the door was darkness, danger, but at the same time, it might be the only way out. She had no other choice. If she didn't open the door, she would die here, consumed by the building like the others. In Linda's hand was a knife, the only thing she could use to protect herself, though she knew it was useless against the supernatural entity. But holding the knife gave her a bit of courage, a bit of control, in a completely desperate situation. She walked slowly towards the door, each step heavy as if she was stepping into a bottomless abyss. Whispers began to echo from somewhere. Initially, they were gentle sounds, but they quickly became clearer, as if the building was speaking to her. "Don't go." A chilling voice echoed, full of invitation but also full of threat. "Stay here. We will take care of you." Linda stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't trust these whispers. They weren't promises, they were temptations, traps. She stood before the wooden door, her trembling hand placed on the knob. The knife in her hand glowed under the flickering light, like a small ray of hope in the darkness. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "If this is the only way to escape," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fear, "then I will do it." The story ends with the image of Linda standing before the door, knife in hand, ready to act. The whispers from the building continued, growing louder, as if mocking her despair. But Linda's eyes shone with a glimmer of determination, even though she knew she might never return. And then, the darkness completely swallowed everything.